Okay, so yeah, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to participate in the seminar. Looking forward to the discussion and also to the presentation to be given by Beatriz. So my presentation is on the role of the European Union in climate and energy governance. And my co-author and I, Andrea Frontera, we basically use the concept of a catalytic state as a concept for thinking through how the role of the European Union has changed over the years and has become increasingly active, increasingly more interventionist, within the field of climate and energy governance. But I would say that this is also a bit of a case study, and it can also be applied to other sectors and other areas of governance, although I would also argue that climate and energy governance are one of the areas where pressure, outside pressure, has kind of pushed the European Union towards taking this more activist role, which may not be the case in the same way in some other fields. This is actually an article that's already available. It's published in the journal New Political Economy, and it can also be accessed. There's because it's open access. It's available open access from the journal. So encourage you, of course, to have a look at it. So the background. So like I said, the climate and energy sector have some unique challenges, but also some more general challenges that we can then see the European Union or the European Commission responding to in this policy field. So first of all, of course, there's the challenge of climate change itself. So, while the European Union has traditionally taken the role of really managing or promoting competition in the European single market, this has been the focus. That has also been the focus in the energy sector. In early years, or let's say, in the 90s, starting in the 90s, this was very much the focus in the energy sector when the European Union really started engaging in that sphere. And it was about liberalizing the market. And then now, with climate policy becoming more and more of an issue, with climate change being more of a challenge, recognized as such, there's need for more than just competition in energy markets. There's also need for transformative change towards a climate neutral energy system, which is also now the explicit goal of the European Union by the year 2050. On top of that, and in addition to that climate challenge, we also have seen, especially over the last, let's say, 5 years with the Trump administration, that geoeconomic challenges have surfaced as important, well, I don't want to say driver, but important sort of context for pretty much anything the European Union is doing. It's sort of multilateral agenda, which has been the characteristic of the European Union, also on the international stage, is increasingly under strain. The liberal trade regime is also under strain. Again, this was traditionally the focus of the European Union as an actor, is to promote that liberal trade regime, both inside the domestic or inside the single market, but also beyond the single market. And this, of course, predates the Trump administration. But of course, there's been increasing competition from a state-driven Chinese economy, but also some, let's say, geoeconomic challenges from countries like Russia and its state influence also on the gas sector. So all of those things, those different challenges, have really placed or raised some questions about whether the European Union's approach to energy market governance is really sufficient to confronting those challenges. And so the questions that we ask in this paper is, how is the European Union responding to these challenges, and how is this response that we, I think, do see, how is it then changing the role of the European Union as a state actor within this context, within the climate and energy sector, which again, like I said before, I think is sort of at the forefront of these developments, but it's not necessarily unique. So there's been a lot of scholarship about the European Union as a state actor, and within that context, there's really been a focus on this idea of a regulatory state. And basically, that is based on the idea that the European Union is actually not a state. You know, it's a de facto state, but it's not a state. It's actually basically an entity that is based on international agreements between a number of state actors, between a number of nation states. So even though it has this role as a kind of a de facto state, it lacks some of the capabilities and competencies that normal state actors would have and have. So firstly, it's highly restricted in its revenue-raising capabilities. It's until recently been almost entirely dependent on the money transferred from the member states to the European Union and to the European Commission. That has been that's what constituted the European budget, or the European Union budget. It's dependent on almost everything it does on agreement among member states. It always has to be based on that agreement. So there always has to be a negotiation process between the EU or the Commission and the member states. And of course, its mandate, the mandate that it's based on, and that it sort of has to also retain its raison d'etre, like the reason for actually existing, is to actually promote the single market, because that's really what keeps everything together. That's also what gives the European Union its strength, is that it has this single market, as we have seen, I think, also in the Brexit negotiations. I mean, you know, there's this is really critical to the existence of the European Union. So based on these restrictions, the European Union has been described as a regulatory state. It's a state that really works through these common directives that it agrees with the member states, and then asks essentially, or then based on that agreement, forces the member states to implement at the nation state level. That has been sort of the main source of its power, of its state capabilities, is to issue these regulations and, yeah, basically complete the single market. And but what we're saying is that, yes, of course, these restrictions, in many ways, they're still in place, but the European Union is trying to go beyond this regulatory state role. It's trying to break out of that, because of the challenges that it faces, but it of course doesn't have the capabilities, like I said, that a positive state, or sort of a traditional state, has. So it's trying to find some kind of a middle ground, something in between this positive state and this regulatory state role, to, yeah, what we have called, like, take on this kind of catalytic role. Doesn't directly do things necessarily, but it tries to catalyze and entice actors to do things themselves. So here are just some characteristics of these sort of ideal type state models. Of course, they are, like I said, ideal types. So clearly, you know, any state probably has some of these characteristics, or all of these characteristics in some way. But we would argue, you know, that traditionally the EU has been more on the regulatory state side, so making rules, monitoring and enforcing those rules, using regulations, but also market-oriented policy instruments to drive its policy agenda. In the climate space, it was the European emissions trading scheme, which is the market-oriented but also regulatory-based policy, towards dealing with climate change, while withholding this whole idea of the single market and the competition and so on and so forth. Now, the positive state, that's what traditional state does. It can also provide goods. It can act as, it can work through its ministries, and also have state-owned enterprises, and be more direct also in terms of spending money. to intervene as a state. And then the catalytic state, and that's what we see here, I think, with the European Union, is, has a more of a facilitating role, acts as a catalyst, a facilitator, and it acts in concert with others. It engages in public-private partnerships, it facilitates, it provides information, and it works with financial instruments. But due to the restriction of its financing capabilities, it also tries to leverage other actors' funds, so private actors, through its financial engagements. And we do see that if we look at this map, this is kind of a timeline, and it shows you what was basically been going on in European energy and climate policy. I cannot see my slides myself, which is a bit irritating. Just a second. So we see, like, in the 90s, we really only have this top part of the chart where what we call the evolving regulatory state, and we see that there was, the first energy package, the second energy, the third energy package. That was all about creating the competition and completing a liberal energy market in the European Union. At the same time, there were some directives. There was the introduction of the European trading scheme, emissions trading scheme. And on the bottom part of the chart, we don't really see anything at that stage. It's what we call the emerging catalytic state. And then around 2010, or a little bit before that, we really start seeing on the bottom that the European Union starts engaging in basically low carbon innovation policy. It created this the SET plan, the Strategic Energy Technology Plan. It created the what is it called? The NER 300 fund, which is a fund for funding low carbon energy technologies. Then we have the 10E initiative, which is for infrastructure investments in Europe, so network infrastructure in the energy sector. And then after the financial crisis, it took a little bit of time. First, we had the European Economic Recovery Plan, wasn't very big. But then after that, once they had sort of figured out how to work with these financial instruments, the investment plan for Europe really expanded the role of the European Union as really investing financial resources and trying to catalyze private resources. And now what we've seen is also in the last few years is the emergence of different industrial alliances, the Green Deal investment plan, which turned into the Green Recovery Plan. And really we see this very expanded role of the European Union as working with financial instruments, but those are not just grants or loans, but there's a lot of work with these investment vehicles, also through the European Investment Bank, to then really catalyze other investments from other actors. And at the same time, at the top of the chart, we then see how also on the regulatory level, the European Union has moved, especially at the very top end, from not just creating a single market for energy, but also developing a market design which is also able to accommodate renewable energy. So this is really the evolution that we've seen. Actually, I was going to show you this in a little bit more detail. I already went through this, so I'll skip over it. And so now just, this slide kind of maps out some of the different sort of policy instruments and vehicles that the European Union uses in this area of industry and innovation, and also in financing of networks and infrastructure. I mentioned the 10E at the very right-hand side. This is actually something that started, like I said, sort of right around the financial crisis, but it wasn't really being used for a long time. It was very minimal. Now, in the last few years, it's become much bigger, much more important in scope. Much larger shares of the investment are being financed by the European Union, and you can really see an expansion of this role. Like I said, you have the industrial alliances, the SET plan. Those are all composed. All these different elements, they're composed of different governance arrangements. There's multi-stakeholder alliances that kind of, governance arrangements that bring the European Commission together with different actors in the system, including the member states, to govern these processes. There's information and advisory interventions that try to also bring together actors and provide platforms to bring them together and set up connections also between actors. And then finally, there's this area of non-traditional and blended finance, which I was referring to, such as the Connecting Europe facility, which is a blending of grants and debt. So there's a lot of grants that come from the European Commission that then get blended with loans from the European Investment Bank. And there's a number of other similar vehicles that the European Union has expanded massively and is expanding further in the context of the Corona recovery, in terms of the in the context of the Green Deal, which has turned into the Green Recovery, expanding it further. So actually, when we wrote this paper, we were still before Corona, right? So we didn't know this was going to happen. But what we see now is that all of these things that we were mapping out before Corona, they've really kind of exploded in a sense with Corona and with the Green Recovery. And so what we're seeing is that, these catalytic state capacities are merging alongside existing regulatory state capacities. Regulatory state capacities are simultaneously evolving from a focus on market liberalization to reforming market designs. Then, like I said now a few times, blended forms of finance and cooperation with public banks are very central to this, also for leveraging private finance. Another issue that we've seen when looking at this a little bit more closely is that blended finance is effective at catalyzing investment, but it also raises a lot of questions, accountability questions, governance questions. And what we can also see, and I was already alluding to this, is that all of this is kind of expanding and becoming more and more significant with the Corona response. Number one, we've seen now there's an expansion of EU level borrowing. So there's this was not in place, when we were starting to write this paper. Now we have substantial EU level borrowing. That means to fund the Green Recovery Plan. This implies that there will be more revenue raising capabilities that will come online. One of them that they're looking at is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. I think is not a very suitable vehicle for doing that, because you're basically raising revenue from outside the European Union to fund the European Union, which has some problematic aspects. Then there's the EU taxonomy, the recovery and resilience facilities, which is an expanded, use of blended finance. The EIB is expanding, is becoming more of a climate bank. And we see that these capacities are starting to be deployed more and more also in the neighborhood and in Africa. And like I said before, basically this raises a big research agenda to assess what the implications of these developments are from different perspectives, especially governance and accountability, but also effectiveness. I mean, and also geoeconomic and international political economy type of questions. So how does this, what does this mean vis-a-vis these geoeconomic challenges that I mentioned, etc. And I think I'll leave it there, and I'm hoping that I stayed in the time, but I think I probably did. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Ryan, for your presentation. I just realized we have a little problem on the beginning of our streaming, so we didn't stream the presentation of this webinar, so I'll do it again. So we already got the presentation of Dr. Reiner. Dr. Reiner has a bachelor in Metropolitan Studies at the New York University, a master in Development Studies at the Erasmus University Rotterdam in Netherlands, and a PhD at the Environmental Policy Research Center at the Freie University Berlin. He's currently research group leader and speaker of the research area on energy transitions and societal change at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies. This webinar is is organized by GEOPI, the Laboratory of Studies on Research, Organization and Innovation, with partnership with INCISPO project And this webinar is a part of a series of webinars organized by GEOPI that you can access the previous videos on our YouTube page. And I also invite you for our next seminar that will be on December 10th at 1:30 p.m. With the theme of public communication of science. For this webinar, this webinar will discussing research development and innovation policies in energy sectors. We already got the Dr. Reiner's presentation, and we have following the Beatriz Couto Ribeiro. She has a bachelor in public policies and management at the University of Campinas and masters of the interdisciplinary program in humanity and applied social sciences. She's currently a PhD candidate in the scientific and technological policy program, and she's a scholarship holder in the chair of innovation economics in Berlin Institute of Technology. So I will let the floor for Beatriz now, and yeah, the word is yours, Bea.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you, Vinicius. Thank you, Edilaine and Reiner, for the great presentation. And thank you all for the GEOPI team also for hosting and give us the opportunity of sharing our research. And now I will talk about what I'm developing here during my exchange in the TU University of Berlin, in the Technische University of Berlin. I'll just share my slide with you guys. And can you see it, Vinny?
Yes, yes, you can see it.
Okay. So now we, in Reiner's presentation, we talked more about like what's this overview about how the EU is changing also to accommodate this new type of policies that emerge in his case on the because of climate change and also energy transition. And I will focus a little bit more in this context. So connecting these policies and regulations that support innovation in this context. So here, this is the title of my this working development, the effects of RDI regulations on electricity sector in OECD countries. And here I will give a brief context what was happening in electricity sector in the late 30, more or less 30, 40 years. So the electricity sector came up on the 80s and 90s for on a process of deregulation and privatization to increase competition in this sector. And also one of the motivations for this is to give more efficiency and more true innovation and through transformative technology introduction of these sectors. So what we can see, despite of the fact that there was more competition on these sectors, they still being regulated. So privatization to increase competition. Oh, I can hear my. Also one of the Reiner, I think you're. Yeah. So where was I? So yeah. So there is this. There was this price regulations that also in some way they prevented the regulations because they impose boundaries in how much the companies can profit from these efficient gains. So it, in some sense, it prevents also the innovation itself, because as we see into in our theoretical literature in innovation economics, one of the major motivations of the companies to innovate are the profits that they can get from that. And in regulated profits, this incentive is diminished. So then during the the 2000s, there was a new type of regulation that emerged. That's what I'm calling these RDI regulations, and were regulations more focusing to properly focus in giving incentives in terms of innovation, technology, and researching in this type of sectors. So, and nowadays we can see some works also, they focus on mapping this type of RDI regulations and check where they are settled. So one of the hypotheses that I bring into my work is that these type of regulations have like a positive effect on the countries that introduced it. So, and I used to circumvent what are RDI regulations. I used some of these works that are here mentioned. And the definition, after getting this overview of what they say about these RDI regulations, so we circumvent these regulations are specific innovation stimulus mechanisms in the segment of generation, transmission, and distribution in the electricity sector. So that were fostered by or the legislation level or the regulatory authority itself. And we are only checking for explicit RDI regulations that were clear mentioned in their in some law or in some regulation. So, and here I did a small effort also of giving this major division to create subsets of how this type of regulation was applied. So in some countries of our treatment sample, so we can see that this type of regulations introduced by subsidizing projects. Also, there are some energy funds that are directly focused on RDI projects. We have in Sweden, especially, we have a case of a company that's a subsidiary of the main transmission company that's from the public sector, that also is only focused on this type of activities in innovation and development. And there are also in some countries specific guidelines that influence this technical development. And we have the special case of United Kingdom that designed a new type of regulatory framework that's based to foster this type of activities in their electricity sector. And here is the design of our model. So this model that I present today, it covers 26 countries in OECD, and it covers the period between 1991 and 2016. Is an unbalanced panel. Here is our treatment group and our control group. And to verify this difference among the countries and the impact, the effects of this, this policy, we use the IPCH from OECD. And as other control variables, we included market regulation. That's an important variable in these countries, and it is also stated in the literature, because lower levels of regulation means more competition on the sectors, therefore would be good for the sector to have low degrees of market regulations, and has an impact on innovation. And also we included in our model, so research and development expenditures that was for from the IEA organization, that's the International Energy Agency, and also informations about personnel that's also related to R&D, and also the measures of electricity consumption from these countries. And here are the countries that make part of our our research. And we have also the RDI policy, RDI regulation, when was which one it is, and the year when it was introduced. So as we can see, we will reanalyzing a difference in difference model, but with multiple times period in this case. And here is interesting also, on blue, we can see all the, here, like with the colors, we can see all the countries that are present in our sample. And it's interesting to also notice that the countries that were treated, that means that had this type of regulation, are mainly on the EU continent, in European continent. And so that's interesting to know how also, I think, their policies are affecting what is happening in terms of regulation, the electricity sector in this area. Something's happening there, like we can see this pattern. And here's our economical model. So from the difference in difference. So here is the countries. I represent the countries, T represent the year, and we can see this post effect of when the policy is introduced, and also the different variables that I mentioned before are also in this model. And we can see also the time fixed effects and time and country fixed effects that then we are controlling when also to exclude also unobservable effects on this sample, and also the arrow terms at the end. And here is a summary of our statistics. So with differentiating the control and the treatment group, with the number of, with the N of the sample in each one of them, and their mean and the standard errors among all of the variables that were introducing our model. It's important also to highlight that we had also GDP as a variable, but we excluded giving problems of multicollinearity with the electricity consumption. And here is also interesting to check the average patents amount of each, the control and treatment group. Also, they allow us to see the assumptions of pre-trans assumption here, even though when is a multi-time period, difference in difference is quite hard also to have this measure, but we are going to apply another method that will be better to see this assumption. And so also we illustrate the year that each country introduced their RDI regulation until 2016. And here are also the behavior of the other variables. So, So we have, I cannot see it, so because I have, it's hard to see. But yeah, we have like the electricity consumption variable, the RDI budget, and the behavior of R&D personnel, and the other one is the market regulation variable as well. So we can compare the behavior of both groups, the treatment and control group. We can see, I think the legends are a little bit wrong here. Sorry about this. Here is the market regulation, and here is the electricity consumption. I think is misplaced at this, the legends itself, but we can see that overall the market regulation for both groups decreased, and there is also a difference in the behavior we can see about the electricity consumption of both groups. In terms of R&D personnel, they follow the same trend line, but but we see a decrease overall in both groups. And in terms of R&D budget, we see that in the treated group, we see a catching up at the end of the period, but in the control group, more or less a stability on this matter. And here is the result of our two-way fixed effects to measure the DID. So here, these first two models, they represent actually the regression. So the first one only with the without the control group, so we can see like high number of patents, and then when we include the controls, this number decrease among the effect. And here, yes, we have the proper effect on the last model when we include both time fixed effects and country fixed effects of the difference among the two groups. So we can see an effect of 233 patents, in which also what is interesting to see that the other covariates that are significant in this model are the budget and also electricity consumption as the impact. The R&D personnel is not significant in this model, and also market regulation is not significant. In terms of market regulation, it's important to highlight that we used a data set from OECD, but that they rebuilt it because there was some missed, because they stopped to collect a period of time, but they gave us like this data set, and they did a estimative, but we don't know how much this is impacting the data or not. So, and also apart from the two-way fixed effects, we also controlled for time and country fixed effects. So the first one refers to the time fixed effects, and we see when we compare the countries throughout time. So we have like a higher impact in terms of patents, a higher output in these terms. But when we compare the countries without the unobservable variables, these impacts decrease. And then, yeah. And here we use it, given that the two-way fixed effects nowadays in the literature of econometrics is being quite a lot being discussed, because they say that it doesn't cannot cover, or it gives less weights to earlier and later adopters in this more staggered type of model of difference and difference. We applied this model of Chase and Martin, and we can see the assumption of a pre-trends comparability among the three groups, because they remain more or less the same. And then after the treatment period, we can see an increase on this during the years of about this difference among the treated and control group. So, but it's interesting also to see that this difference only starts at after 7 years, so in 2013. And this also could be discussed given the nature of the innovation and research that only have effects in the more medium or long term. So here are some conclusions about this study that is we still didn't finish, and is more, so we can see that there is a concentration of these RDI regulations in European countries, and they show positive results in the relationship with the introduction of these RDI regulations, and in terms of using as an output of innovation the patents. And there is also a positive and significant correlation between this increase in patents and also the R&D budget and electricity consumption of these countries. And we also, is interesting to, we think that also this this effect, that non-significant effect regarding the R&D personnel, is because on the literature, there is this discussion that the regulated sectors and also in consequence electricity are supplier regulated. So we think that maybe even this personnel is not so maybe that meaningful for the introduction of this, the increment of these patents. And the limitations of our study, so there are a limited number of countries that we got the data to also be part of the sample. And there is also a difficulty to distinguish the variation on the impacts of these different RDI regulations. I think the implications of this study is more focusing to the proper implication of this type of RDI regulations. So based on our, this research would be useful if you want to increase the levels of patents to introduce this type of regulation on the country itself. So that was it. Thank you. And yeah, I'm open to questions.
Thank you so much, Bia. I think we could go to Edilaine remarks, and then we can start the questions and discussion among you three. Before I give the floor to Edilaine, I will present her. So Edilaine Camillo has a bachelor in economic science at the State University of São Paulo, a master and PhD in University of Campinas. Edilaine also is a postdoctoral research fellow and research professor at the Department of Science Technology Policy at the University of Campinas. In her main research subjects are innovation in industrial policies, sustainability transitions, and renewable energies. So, Edilaine, I think we are ready for your comments and your remarks. So the floor is yours. You're muted.
Sorry. Thank you, Vinicius, for presenting me. Thank you for inviting me for participating in the seminar. I really enjoy reading both papers, and I recommend our viewers to read that because it's very insightful. I've already read a previous work from Rainer on solar photovoltaic from 2015 that was very useful to understand the industrial dynamics. And it's nice to put a face on the name today. So thank you, Rainer, for more insightful. I will make some comments on each paper presentation, brief comments, and after that, some more general remarks relating the papers with some previous research that I have done, because there are some common points, and also some literature that I have explored, especially on policy mix, because Rainer mentioned in their paper the policy mix, and I've already worked with this concept sometimes. So about the Frontiera and Quitzow or Rainer and Andrea paper, Dr. Rainer has pointed out in his presentation several elements of European context to illustrate the catalytic state I'd like to point out the applicability of the concept of catalytic state, because I see several possibilities to explore the concept for other kind of analysis, like country analysis, or to combine with other frameworks of policy analysis. From my previous researches, I've already had problems to put the incentive mechanisms or some kind of governance and government strategy in the positive state or regulatory state. So when I read the paper, I realized several things that was in the middle ground between regulatory state and positive states. So I think it opens a lot of possibilities for further applications or further analysis and researchers on, especially on sustainability transition and energy policies, climate policies. This is my main comments for Fronteira and Quitzow. Ribeiro et al. I'm not a mathematician, but so I don't have comments on the model itself, but I think the work of Beatriz complements very well the work of Fronteira and Quitzow, because Beatriz brings some quantitative evidence regarding the positive impact of RDI regulation on the patents outputs and the OECD countries. So I think Beatriz brings some evidence that confirms the need of more interventionist state, and not so positive, but not so regulatory. So I think it's a good complement on Dr. Rainer's work. Beatriz and the co-authors focus on research, development, and innovation regulation. I think we can bring some or do some association with our RDI regulation in Brazil from the National Energy Agency. I think it's kind of similar, and I think it will be very, very interesting if Beatriz or other research could explore maybe the same model with the Brazilian case, and or combining other countries and other cases, but I see the similarity and it's very, very interesting. I think the attempts of establishing a correlation between incentive mechanisms and innovation results is a very, very good exercise, because I'm always analyzing incentive mechanisms and to show the innovative efforts in quantitative terms related to the regulation. It's useful, and congrats, Beatriz, and I think you can finish the work and publish it soon. My broader considerations, I have three main considerations or remarks. Some OECD countries that do not have a formal R&D regulation program, like the countries Beatriz put in your paper, they may have other kind of R&D programs or incentives oriented to suppliers and technologies related to electric sector. I've studied 3 countries from that list: Canada, Japan, and Spain, and I know there are some incentives. So maybe further work or further reflection on the role of this other kind of incentives in the patents in the electric sector could be maybe a possibility. And the second consideration, how the concept of catalytic state may be applied to explain the strategies of individual states members of the European Union, or even other countries. I've been studying the trajectory of renewable energy in developing countries. So the more successful countries in the catching up process are the interventionist state, positive state, but maybe the catalytic state, the concept of catalytic state may be useful to analyze other experiences in the middle and explain a lot of things that I've been observing, but there is not really a concept to characterize that. My third remark, how the new kind of interventions or governance arrangements related to the catalytic state may pose new challenges to the coherency of policy mix. The coherency of policy mix has been discussed in the policy analysis literature, and more recently, this has been discussed on climate and energy policies. The OECD actually has a framework for policy coherency for sustainable development. So I think when there are other kind of instruments added to the policy mix, you may have some problems like layering, and when you add new goals and instruments without abandoning previous one, maybe occurring incoherency amongst the goals and inconsistency related to the instruments or the other processes that is mentioned in the literature of policy analysis, the drift, when you change the policy goals without change the instruments, which become inconsistent with the original goals. So it's important to outline instrument mix interact. There are interdependencies of instruments that influence the combined effects of the instrument mix and thus the achievement of policy objects. So I think it's interesting to join this discussion to the new governance arrangements that is coming from, that's emerging from this change from regulatory states and catalytic states. It's more I'd like to bring that because I think it's one of the possibilities to dialogue with the previous literature and to add other elements in the catalytic concept and maybe other frameworks for policies analysis. I think this is what I'd like to remark, and thank you and congratulations for both for the work you present.
Okay, thank you, Edilaine. I think we have time for Rainer and Bia to comment if you want.
You can go first.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, I mean, thanks for the nice comments and useful comments. Also, I mean, I think the last few points that you were raising are obviously sort of present. So basically, the as I was saying also in the presentation, I mean, it's not that the EU is no longer pursuing its role as a regulatory state. It's still, yeah, that's still sort of its core identity, but it's trying to supplement and this with these more catalytic measures. And of course, they're that's in a way already a process of layering. So we have sort of the regulatory identity being layered with this more catalytic space. And it also creates some contradictions, I think, because this whole agenda of completing and deepening the single market and the competition within that obviously is a bit at odds with some of the more transformational goals that are being pursued with these more interventionist measures. And one of the ways that I think the European Union is trying to deal with that is that it's creating this EU financial taxonomy or taxonomy regulation for basically defining what they consider sustainable investments and being very, very meticulous and specific about it, to then create sort of a blueprint or a framework for guiding where these catalytic measures should or shouldn't go, and what they should or shouldn't be supporting. But of course, I mean, you're not going to be able to completely resolve these tensions, because I mean, the objective of promoting competition in a situation where you have to sort of favor certain technologies so that they can develop more rapidly and replace existing technologies, sort of at odds with that idea. And but I think it's also inherent to innovation policy in a way, because innovation policy is always about promoting new technologies, which in essence is at odds with the idea of competition or level competition. But we know why it's necessary. It's necessary because there is no actually perfect market that perfectly drives kind of the allocation of resources towards the most societally, those technologies are the most benefit to society. And so, yeah, this is kind of the messiness I think we have to deal with when we deal with innovation policy. And I mean, as I pointed out also in the previous paper on this topic of policy mixes, I mean, I think this, of course, there's a case to be made for coherence in policies. We want coherent policies. We want mutually reinforcing policies. But when you're trying to transform a system, then you are confronted with an incumbent system, and this incumbent system it needs to be changed, and it can't be changed all at once, right? So in order to change it over time and transform it over time, you need to introduce inconsistencies into that system. You need to do things that are not consistent with the incumbent policy regime, essentially, because that will still be in place. And then this can then over time create this kind of process, mutually reinforcing process, where new technologies start developing, and then as a result challenge certain policy patterns in the incumbent regime, which then kind of drives this process of change, not only in terms of technology, but also in terms of policy. And then you move towards a system that is more coherent again, right? So I guess this in a way is what we see with this these developments in the European Union, is that the regulatory paradigm is not entirely consistent with the goals of transformation. So you need these additional instruments, and over time this will also be reflected in the regulatory paradigm, I believe.
I can go, yeah. First of all, thank you, Edilaine, for your comments. And I think I will say a little bit about the comments more focusing to my analysis. And I for sure, I was inspired first, me and my co-authors, by the ANEL. We had some experience on this topic before, and it was when it came my first contact with the RDI, what I call about RDI regulations. And once I came here in Germany, I had this question on my mind, like, how could I measure? Because currently, I think I couldn't make like a good evaluation about the ANEL with quantitative data. So would be more like focusing to qualitative data. And I had this question on my mind, and I came here and I came to study with Knut, that's also one of our co-workers, and additionally Professor Adriana and also Luciani from Unicamp. So I had this question on my mind, and I got it also in contact. He is a specialist on regulation, and I got in contact with this data from OECD countries that's more that allows this type of comparison. And of course, other countries, as you mentioned, Canada, Japan, also Korea and Spain, they have other type of strategies. And I think it's also interesting to have this idea. So I think also in the direction of what Rainer was saying about having a taxonomy of regulations or type of policies about how can you better support these types of initiatives towards like innovation. So I think is what I try to do in this paper. So gathering countries that more or less have the same direction and they have like the same proposal, and compare with the other ones that are in some extent also comparable, and check if they have a better or a worse result in some terms. So I think, yeah, was that was the goal of applying this method here. And I would like also maybe in the next years also to apply this in ANEL, with ANEL, or maybe like in some more specific policy. I don't know, hydrogen is also coming. There is also those strategic projects of ANEL that I find really interesting. So I think for the following years, we will have a lot of new perspectives to research on.
Okay, thank you, Bia. Edilaine, you have any comments on this?
No, I'm very glad for the reflection from Rainer, and I hope Bia can go through the challenge of measure ANEL and other countries, and I'm sure you do a great job. Thank you both.
Okay, we have a question from our audience, so I think it's directed to Bia. But if Rainer and Edilaine has some comments, you can go. But the question is, what is needed to improve evaluation of regulation, not just RDI regulation? What's needed to improve the evaluation of regulation on innovation?
Do you want to go first, Rainer, or can you? Okay. To improve, I think in terms of quantitative perspective, when I was analyzing, I faced a lot of challenge regarding the data available from the countries. I don't think, on patents you have it, but I think it's more also about the other control variables. And also when you think like for patents, you get like easy some data, but when you think about the other impacts that also those RDI regulations could have, so in terms of personnel, in terms of, I don't know, papers, so I find, or other types of impacts, it's still, I think, hard to capture those effects, and for sure they have also these effects.
Okay, I think I have a question for Rainer. It's mine. It's my question now. Rainer, we are discussing like these last weeks a lot about the COP26, and nations are discussing policy, international climate policies. And my question is, what are the expected role of a catalytic state in this kind of negotiations, in these international climate policy negotiations? I bring this question because it's a subject now on the news, so I think maybe it's important to think about it. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question. I mean, to be honest, in a way, if you look at what was it? I mean, the COP in Copenhagen. Okay, the COP in Copenhagen failed, right? And I would say that the COP in Copenhagen, that one was still kind of based on the idea of the European Union at the time. European Union considered itself a leader in climate policy, has always considered itself that, and in many ways was also a leader. But it failed in inspiring, let's say, other countries to follow its lead at the COP in Copenhagen, and it failed. Then 5 years later in Paris, we were successful, right? Or the international community was successful, not only with the leadership of the European Union, also of China and the US, because it was preceded by the agreement between the US and China at the time. But what we also saw is we saw really a shift from basically this approach where the European Union was trying to oppose certain budgets of CO2 emissions that then would be distributed across the international system, and everybody would be responsible for reducing their CO2 emissions, to a system which is very much innovation oriented, and which was based on saying, well, okay, everybody needs to make a big effort, and then we need to actually accelerate and improve on that over time. And that's this like ambition mechanism in the Paris Agreement and the NDC process and so on and so forth. So really what we saw is, in a way, a shift not only within the European Union, but also in the COP, from a regulatory state approach to a catalytic state approach. And that's why we have what we have now. Now, of course, it's not working the way it should be. We still don't have the kind of ambition and effectiveness that we need to see to reduce emissions. Emissions are actually rising. They're not being reduced globally. So you know, we can argue whether Paris is at this point still promising to be a success, or if it kind of promising to maybe be a failure. But I think you know, it was needed. This shift was needed to at least do something and to move towards a positive agenda, which I think climate change in a certain way can be. You know, it can be a driver for innovation. It can be a driver for an investment. It can also be a driver for catching up. I mean, China sees it as such. You know, they see climate change and environment and energy innovation, let's say, as an opportunity for catching up economically and being an industrial leader. And I think this is kind of the idea also captured by this catalytic state model, that, you know, we need governments not just to set rules, we also need the government to stimulate and enable innovation. And I mean, I was just writing a short piece on lessons from Corona for climate and energy policy, or climate change action in general. And I think, I mean, there is something to learn from the vaccine development, which was obviously a very close collaboration between private and public actors. We saw, I mean, it's not maybe as readily known that, I mean, the Moderna vaccine was supported by the US government with about $1 billion in R&D funding in 2020, before they got the vaccine approval. the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine was supported by about, well, was a grant of almost 400 million euros from the German government, of which only about 250 were dispersed in 2020. But also that's about 25% of the R&D expenditures in 2020 for the vaccine development. And then, of course, there was the advanced purchase agreements that created a guaranteed market for the vaccines if they were actually successful. And there was a whole kind of process of expediting the regulatory approval, which was another important measure that was taken. So that taken together, I think, can't be replicated for everything we want to do in climate and energy, but it shows what's possible if public and private actors actually work together on a very clearly defined mission and target. And I think in many ways, we really need to move down towards that. We need to do more of that. We need to be sort of courageous and experiment and get our hands dirty as governments, as public actors, together with private actors, but also learn from that, right? Learn from the mistakes that are made and learn from the failures, because there will be failures, and this is to be expected, but it's something we need to learn from. And I think one of the things also to learn, of course, from the COVID experience, the COVID example, is that there were some issues with spending so much money. I know a little bit less about the Moderna than about the BioNTech, which was the German case. Germany providing a lot of money, the vaccine being deployed mainly in the US initially, but also now the question of rolling out the vaccine throughout the planet, throughout the world. It's actually facing some problems. It's hard to know really what the really source of the problem is. The private actors, they say it's not because of the patents, it's because of capacities that need to be built up. But of course, they need to support that as well. There's a big discussion about patent waivers. The European Union is against that, is not allowing that to happen. But I think what could have been done without necessarily needing patent waivers in that case would have been to include some language in some of these agreements that were made for providing the funding, for doing the advanced purchase, and so on and so forth, for that would force, or that would require BioNTech, in this case Pfizer and BioNTech, to actually go and build up those production capacities, make the patents available under certain conditions, and so on and so forth. Then we might not be in a situation where we even have to discuss a big blanket waiver of patents in the WTO, because there are obviously some drawbacks to doing that. And the important thing is like building up the production capacities. And this could have been maybe planned for. So what I'm trying to say is we need these experiments, we need this cooperation, but we also need to learn from them and be smart about how the public engages with the private sector. And this was a bit off topic potentially, but.
That's nice. Thank you so much for your answer. We have here another question for Bia. Bia, from Professor Sergio Salles. Given your observations, how should we take your findings in terms of policy recommendations? And also have another observation here. The treatment and control groups have countries whose prior technological trajectories are heavily based on patents, Germany and Japan. A last observation, Brazilian R&D in the electricity sector is heavily regulated, but the outputs and outcomes are not comparable to those found in developed countries. Given these observations, how should we take your findings in terms of policy recommendations?
Yeah, I think I will focus more, try to answer is quite a difficult question, how you should, because I'm mostly comparing OECD countries and they are like the big, a group of big economies here in the whole world. So it's really difficult to put, to compare like I think their policies with the impact of their policies with the developing country. And one way could be, let me check it again. Could you repeat? I got a little bit lost. Could you repeat, please, Vinicius, the question?
How, given these observations and studies, observations, how should we take your findings in terms of policy recommendations?
Yeah, so I think, yeah, I remember the point that I wanted to highlight. So even inside the EU, we have also difference into these RDI regulations. So I think actually, and this is one of the limitations that I highlighted, that we don't know the exactly impact of each one of this type. We know, we could see at least that there was some difference and some positive impacts, but it would be for a next research would be interesting to get to know like more comparatively their difference, and then check the results. And then after that, I think then yes, we could make it more replicable in terms of policy recommendation for other countries. So far is more yeah, a general result, I should say.
Okay, yeah. So I think we have time for a last question. Did you have any question, or can I pick one from the public?
No, I think we have a question here about green hydrogen.
Yeah.
Maybe, yeah. I think it's interesting.
Interesting, yeah. For Dr. Reiner. We have a question from YouTube chat. And how do you evaluate Germany's announcement on investing millions of euros, specifically 34 millions, to develop the green hydrogen market here in Brazil? I don't know if you are aware of this.
Yeah, I'm not really aware of that. I was looking for it. I didn't find this particular announcement. So I don't really know what to say about it, because I don't know what it's for exactly. Is it within the high H2 global context? Is it a
I'm not sure.
I don't really know. I don't really know what it is. So, and I couldn't find it. So
yeah, I also I'm not sure about which.
But I mean, it makes sense, of course. There we go. Here's we just had a discussion with the Federal University in Rio on hydrogen and in Brazil, and it seemed like there was not that much interest yet in Brazil in the context of hydrogen, but it's probably developing quickly. And here it says H2 Brazil. Yeah, I mean, Brazil is obviously, I think it was interested in Brazil during the event. Yeah, okay. Yeah, sorry, I don't really know what to say about it, because I haven't really looked at it. But apart from that, I mean, and there will be the need for some hydrogen also in the Brazilian case. And again, we had this interesting discussion where some of the people at the university in Rio were quite skeptical, let's say, and more used to thinking about biomass as a solution. Mm-hmm. I think personally that this makes sense for Brazil in some areas, but in some areas, not so much for Germany, of course, because biomass is not as available. but even in Brazil, I mean, there will be the need for some hydrogen if we want to go to zero CO2 emissions or climate neutrality, and therefore, and of course, Brazil is an important market for Latin America. So, yeah, important development, I guess.
Guys, I think we are out of time. We still have some questions. Unfortunately, another opportunity. So I would like to thank you all for being here in this webinar. And also, again, I would like to invite all people to our next webinar on December 10th. And the subject will be, let me check, public communication of science and technology. This is the main theme of this next webinar. So, okay, you have the last questions if you want to say something.
Just thanks a lot.
I thank you. Later I can answer this question, send an email to Professor Salles and discuss.
So that's it.
Yeah, thank you very much.